Hi, welcome to 2020 Tasty Treats. This is a new one that we're doing. We're doing some foundation piece blocks this time. So we've got 20 things going on for the Tasty Treats, but this time with the foundation blocks we've got 20 foundation piece blocks going on. So this is going to be block 1. We're just getting started. There's a diagram here of the 20 blocks. There's a whole lot more information on the website on GourmetQuilter.com where you can see all about it and all that sort of thing. You can register to receive the pattern. So if you have registered to receive the pattern, you will have block number 1 here, and I have it almost finished up here. It's a tree. This bit does get joined to that piece there, but we're making it in 2 segments. So if you're not familiar with foundation piecing, I am just going to run through the process. So there's a little bit more information in this video. The ones following, you will know how to do them, but we'll still go through the construction of each block for the next 20 or 19 more days after this, because there's 20 blocks altogether. So the things that I think you need to have is obviously, in this case, a sewing machine. You need to be able to print your pattern. You need to make sure that it's printing the right size. There's a little scale, a 1-inch scale on your pattern, so that you can make sure everything's going to come out the right size. The other thing I would strongly recommend is general cutting and sewing equipment, a rotary cutter and a ruler, maybe even a smaller ruler if you have one, but it's not essential. Another thing I find very useful when I'm doing this is some sort of a light source. So I have here a light box, so I can just flick that on, or it doesn't have to be a light box. It could be a lamp that you can just have, that you can work over, or not at all. It's just one of those things that makes some things a little bit easier if there's a light source shining behind, but you can do it without. So the other thing too, we are going to be sewing through the paper. It is possible to buy specific foundation piecing paper in the marketplace. I don't have any, so I'm just using my regular printer paper, which is slightly heavier. Foundation paper is easier to remove. We will be removing the papers, so just something to consider. But also to help us remove the paper is a little spritzer, like any spray bottle. It doesn't have to be one of these little tiny spritzers. Any spray bottle, so that you can spray a mist of water onto the paper to soften it, to help remove all those little pieces after we finish sewing. So having got to the stage now, we've got some all our tools. With the fabric, if you are wanting to make all of your 20 blocks with a similar background or the same background fabric, because you want to use them in the same project perhaps, then I would suggest that you maybe start with about a yard of fabric. It's a little bit of an unknown quantity because we all work slightly differently. And then from your yard of fabric, maybe just cut yourself some strips. The most common ones I found work for me, that I can then cut down as I need them, is a 1.5-inch wide strip, a 2.5-inch wide strip, and then I've done a 3.5 as well for some just occasional larger pieces. You'll probably need more of the 1.5 and 2.5 as you go along, but that would get you started. For the actual piecing of the coloured fabrics, I'm suggesting that maybe you just use from your stash, because they really are just small pieces. I have a whole lot of 2.5-inch strips that I have not used the whole strip of, so I use up things like that. They're very useful. It does appear to be a little bit of a wasteful process when you do this foundation piecing, because we have to trim off a lot. But the idea, one of the main ideas behind foundation piecing, as far as I can tell, is that you can do awkward, irregular shapes. Tiny shapes sometimes, very pointy shapes that are hard to cut and piece in any other way. So by piecing them onto a foundation and flipping and trimming, which we'll go through shortly, then you can get some really amazing detail, and everything just sits perfectly because it's sitting on that foundation, which we will then remove. So as well as getting foundation papers that you can print on, you could print it on to there's other paper, lightweight papers, if you have access to things like that, that works better. If it's lighter weight, it's just easier to pull out later. There is another option that you could print onto, or trace your designs onto some fabric and just leave it in, so that if you're wanting something a bit more substantial, that would be an extra layer. Another option possibly could be to trace it onto wash away fabric, which means that when you wet it, it disappears. And that works really well if you're happy to trace everything onto it. However, don't use your steam iron and things like that as you're going, because it will also, the steam in it will cause that to disappear, and you might be halfway through a block and it's suddenly just gone. So just be aware of that sort of option. There are other ways of doing foundation piecing, but this is what I'm going to show you this time, is just stitching onto a block of paper. So I'll go ahead and show you what we do next. So I've got my pattern that I've printed out. I've got my this particular block is in 2 segments, as we can see up here. We've got this sort of triangular tree shape, and then we've got the trunk in a separate segment. That's because we're stitching and flipping, and there's no kind of easy way to stitch and flip when you've got 3 pieces. So you make it as another segment, and then you can join it later on. So I've got my pattern shape all out here. I've got segment A here and segment B here. Whilst I like reading all that, I don't need it for the sake of making the block, so I'm just going to trim that away. So all I really want is my block pieces, my segments, roughly cut out. So it's quite a good idea to leave a little bit extra. The trimming size is going to be right along the dotted line. The block size itself is where the solid line is. So we just want to be able to have them roughly cut out so that we've got pieces that are going to be overlapping, and we'll be able to trim it back to that dotted line without too many problems. So just get rid of my pieces out of the way there. So on your sewing machine, another thing to consider is I'm just using regular sewing thread, regular sewing needle, but on your stitch length you want to reduce your stitch length. So this is a banana and my normal stitch length is 2.5. I've reduced it down to 1.5, so just a shorter length. Now there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that if you're sewing through paper, it helps perforate because it's more frequent, so it's going to be easier to tear away. And another aspect would be because you're tearing things away, you're pulling on those seams, and it's just a little bit stronger. So there's 2 good reasons for shortening your stitch length. So to get started, I'm just going to use the light box. I probably wouldn't necessarily need it for every step of the way, but this hopefully it'll allow you to see what I'm doing as well. So if I've got this light source on, I'll brighten it up a bit, and I'm just working on the tree trunk segment at the moment. So what we're doing is we're stitching on this side that's printed. We're placing our fabric behind. So we want the right side of our fabric to be facing away. So this is the right side of my fabric, so it's wrong side of paper to wrong side of fabric. And you may find you want to have a piece of fabric that is larger all round than your shape. So we've only got a little shape here. You want it to go beyond your seam allowance so that we can trim it back nicely afterwards. It doesn't need to be much beyond, but it should be a little bit beyond. And then you want to pin it. Now you could use a temporary glue, or you could use a pin to hold that in place. So that's piece 1 in the middle. Then we need to pop piece 2 on. So I've already got my backgrounds. These are cut from the 1.5 inch strips, which is really only just the right size. So I've got to sew this one on pretty straight. So I'm going to place that behind because my seam is through here. Hopefully you can see this fabric sitting behind. And I want to, this is a very straightforward piece to be starting on with, so that's really good. We want to make sure that's sitting exactly where we want it so that we can sew right on that line, and this piece of fabric is then going to flip back so that that's inside there. So I'm going to go to the sewing machine. I have already shortened my stitch length, and I'm going to start stitching from just beyond the dotted line because I need my seams to go right out to the edge. So you're sewing right on the line, not next to the line, not near the line, on the line. I don't need that. And I'm going to go beyond that dotted line out that side as well. So it's a little bit of toing and froing with this sort of work, but I think you'll find that it works quite well. Just get rid of my thread there. So what we've done now is stitch that to that. So what we want to do is fold back on that line that we've just stitched, and then with our cutter and, in this case, a small ruler, we want to trim 1/4 inch, or it could be slightly less, depends a little bit on the fabric you're using, away from the folded edge, because that's your actual seam line. So you just want that to be trimmed under there so that you've just got a regular sort of seam allowance in there. For some pieces, when we're working with really small pieces, you may want to go slightly less than 1/4 of an inch, but generally you would do about 1/4 of an inch trim in there. So that's going to sit behind there now, so I can put my pin just to hold that out of the way, because we've now got to sew the other piece on. So we could come back to our light source here. Just need a little prop on the back. Whoops. I have 3 settings on my light box. And I'm just going to position that one pretty much with something like this. You can actually just see it. You don't necessarily need the light source, because you probably can't see a second line of fabric when I've used just a dark one through there. So just have a little look and make sure you think it's sitting where you want it to sit. Have a look at where the seam's going to go. That probably could come over just a touch more. So I'm going to be sewing right along that line now. So I've placed that one behind. That's going to flip over. So a little bit confusing when you first get going if you haven't done this before, because you're working kind of back to front. Because that's just the way it is with foundation piecing. But you do get into a little rhythm with it. So same thing now, we want to flip back where we've stitched. We're going to trim that seam. And now we can bring the iron over. Quite often I press every stitched line, but this time it didn't seem to be as necessary. And now we just want to press, so I would probably suggest not having the steam going at this stage, although it probably wouldn't matter too much if you did. And then from there, we want to make sure that we can trim that up. So what we're going to do now, that's all complete on that segment. There is no more to go on there. We want to trim along the dotted line. So I'm just going to place my ruler on. So if you've got a little 1/4 inch line on your ruler, the 1/4 inch line should go on your solid line there, and you should be cutting on that dotted line to trim this segment back. Looking pretty good. So do that on all the dotted lines so that the whole segment is trimmed. And there we've got a nicely trimmed little segment. It's all ready to go. It's a lot like this one. So I can put that to one side now and work on the tree. So we'll just keep going with the tree, but I won't do everything in front of you, because it's much the same sort of process once we get going. So I'm going to be doing my tree. I've got 3 colours. I've actually changed my colours slightly from this one, but I'm still starting with this fairly strong one in the centre. So I'm going to again use my light source. And we want the right side of the fabric down, because we're having the wrong sides of the paper and the fabric together. So we're going to position that. This is my centerpiece, so it's piece number 1. So everything is numbered in order of placement, and it's reasonably important that you follow that. The side to side ones sometimes don't matter if you've got 2 the same on each side. A pin. But generally speaking, if you keep going in the numerical order, you'll find that later on when we're doing some other more fiddly designs, that might make quite a difference. So now I'm going to just pop actually a lighter colour in next. And so I'm going to be sewing on this B2 piece. So I've got to have it so that the right side is up, because then it's right sides of fabric together. And I'm going to be sewing this line. So I need to make sure my fabric is extending beyond beyond that line there, so that when it flips over, that's the seam. So I'm not sure if you can see, or if any of us can see through this darker piece of fabric in the middle. But make sure your strips are extending beyond. You need to be able to sew along this line here, so whatever it takes to make sure you can do that. So another way of doing that would be to make sure, if you do the fold where you're going to be sewing, you may well be able to see where your fabric is sitting. And so then I'm going to go to the sewing machine and I'm going to sew that line in place. So again, extending bit out into that seam allowance area. So stitching right on that line, and you can take the stitching line through a little bit beyond the point that's shown on the pattern so that it's well and truly covered. And so what we want to do now is trim that seam that we've just done. So we're going to fold back on our stitch line, going to lay the ruler on there, and we're going to take the pin out so it's not in the way, and trim our seam. So using the paper as a seam guide, and then we can flip that back. So at this stage I probably would iron these each one as I go, just because I feel that you might have a little finger presser that might do the job for you. I quite like to have my iron handy. So that's already sewn in place. So that was piece number 2. It's way too big, we'll be trimming it down on the next one. So I'm going to go ahead and do exactly the same thing now with piece number 3. Just like we did with that one, I'll use my light source, I'll position my fabric, I'll stitch it and trim it, and then I'll come back and show you the next one because there's a little bit more bulk to trim. So I'm just sewing on piece B5, which is the second of the outside coloured pieces. And I thought I'd show you, because I've got all this bulk to trim, so I've already done this side, but there's all this bulk here to trim. And also we've started stitching up into this little space here, which means that it's harder to pull back, but just pull it back so that you can still press it back on that seam line. And there's a whole lot of this lighter green fabric sitting here which needs to be trimmed off now. So you want that sitting flat or folded right along your seam line. If there's a little bit that you've stitched because you've gone beyond the actual point, which is a good thing, just tear the paper back a little bit. It won't matter because it's all got to come out in the end. So now I'm just going to trim off that seam allowance. I've got my piece sitting underneath. We should all be okay. And of course that piece is big enough to use somewhere else, so you don't always just have to waste everything you trim off. So that's all going to come back there, so I'm going to press that now so that seam allowance sits under there quite nicely. This tree is coming together. So we've got all those pieces sitting there, and now we need to start putting the background pieces on. So it's really just the same thing, it's just more of the same really. So I've got a piece ready here. I just need to line it up. Sometimes through darker fabrics you can't see even with the light source, so I just kind of do a little bit of an eyeball. I can see my line here, and this is where it helps if things extend a little bit because you can just get a bit of an idea where that's going to sit. So I just want that to sit from there through to there so that I can stitch it. So I'll go ahead and stitch this one on and press it, and then I'll stitch the other one on and come back to show you how to do the final pressing and trimming. So just sewing on the second of the background triangles there. I ended up using a slightly wider piece here because it just had to span a little bit further, and I wasn't sure I was going to have enough with my 2.5 inch strip. So I just want to pull that little piece back there, fold that back on that stitched line. I might even need a slightly longer ruler. And trim up. So we've got quite a bit of bulk at this top corner here, but it's all sitting okay. So I'm going to press this back. It is bulky, but because of this, doing it sort of side to side and pressing as you go, everything ends up sitting quite nicely. So that's the tree more or less ready to go. So I'm just going to trim that up so that we can see how that whole segment sits. So just trimming along this dotted line. And there we have a little segment that looks a whole lot like this segment, except that I've changed the colours a bit. So between that and our other tree trunk segment, we now have our two segments that can go together. So just the same as you'd seam anything else together, they've got a 1/4 inch seam allowance on them, so you can just lay them right sides together and you can stitch that seam line, which we'll do. And then we need to take those papers out so that we can see the block without all that foundation in there. So we've got this extra layer of paper, of course, which we have to deal with. So you can decide whether you want to press those seams open. I often do. I find that that presses quite nicely open, but we have got to remove all that paper. So this is a little bit incidental at the moment, but it's nice to have a look at the block like that. So in order to now remove the paper, because we've been stitching and folding and everything, a lot of it's going to be quite easy to just pull away. You may find you want some fine tweezers, or you might have a nice fine pair of scissors or a pin or something to pick out little corners. And if it's a little bit tough and not coming away quite enough or easily enough for you, if you just spritz it, so any spray bottle, this is just a little tiny spray bottle that I happen to have, just to wet that, dampen that paper a little bit. It won't do any harm to anything, but what that will do is just softens the paper so that it's even more easily pulled away. So we just need to go through and pull all that away. So I might continue doing that. I don't know that you need to watch me do every little bit. So make sure you get all the little bits out of these little corners up here. So that's probably more where you might want to soften bits of paper in the corners where they're tight, to pull all that out, because there's already quite a lot of bulk in there. You don't want the paper left in there as well. So this is something that you could sit and do later. My favourite place to do this sort of thing is in front of the TV when I don't have to concentrate too much on other things. So go ahead and pull all your papers out. I'll be back shortly when I've done all that to show you the completed block and how it's actually going to look. So I've gone ahead, I've pulled all my papers out. Slightly painstaking task, but you know, some things are worth doing. I'm really pleased with the tree. I would find it very hard to make a tree with points like that any other way, so I find that the foundation piecing is really good when I want some detailed work. I don't use it, of course, for everything, but it's definitely there for certain opportunities. And so this is going to be my block. It's not looking quite as white. This is not white fabric. It looks extra white there because it's got the white paper behind. So I'm really pleased with the block, the way that's come up. I might just stick one of my pins in to hold it up so I can let go. Just one other thing to consider when you're doing this, because we're flipping back on angles and things, the edges of our blocks are now not on the straight grain, so there's a tendency for them to want to be a little bit wavy. So just be aware of that when that happens. One thing that might help would be to use a spray starch at this stage, so that you could have it all ready and then just spray a little bit of starch just to hold it, so it gives it just that little bit of firmness again. Otherwise your edges are going to possibly be wavy when you sew them into something else. So just as long as you're aware of that, there shouldn't be any problem with that. So that was block 1. That was a whole long lesson this time. Next time it won't be so long because you'll know how to do most of it next time. But we'll see you again for Tasty Treats Foundation Blocks Block 2. Thank you so much.